Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Omar Khalil, Communications Manager at ECA. Today's presentation will outline the top 10 major changes in Amendment 2 of the 18th edition Wiring Regulations, how they can impact your business, and where to get more help, information and support with ECA. Our presenters today should be up on your screen. We've got Darren Cranis in his wonderful Technicolor blazer and Shahid Khan there on the other side of the screen. Over in Rotherick House in London, who'll be on hand to provide support in the Q&A session. In just a moment, I'll hand over to Darren to kick off the presentation, but before I do that, just a reminder that you should be able to ask us a question at any time today using the question mark button on your screen, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. This webinar is CPD accredited, so everyone watching us live today will receive their certificate at the email address that they provided, that you provided when signing up for today's session. The webinar is also being recorded and will be available to watch on demand on ECA's YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/ECA Live. And with that said, I hope you enjoy today's session, and over to you, Darren.
Wonderful, and thank you everyone for attending today. So great to see so many of you, and thank you to my colleagues to assist today as well. So hopefully you can all see the presentation. Just want to double check, if you just pop in the chat that you can see the presentation okay. And we'll get going. So this is the Amendment 2 Top 10. So it's not necessarily all the changes, but it's the changes that we think will impact your business. So it's the top 10 changes that the ECA think will impact your business. It's not all the changes, and it's really important that you pick up a copy of BS 7671 Amendment 2. It's been in force now for a couple of weeks, and look over those parts which you think are relevant to yourself, especially probably special locations or any specialist areas you're in. Like I said, we're just in the top 10 today with some bonus information. And I'm really blessed with Shahid here today to answer any Q&A after our presentation. So we'll go through those now. So very importantly, when we talked about this 6 months ago, it was very green. The regulations were just announced, they just came out. So on the 28th of March, you could pick up a copy of the Amendment 2, design and install to Amendment 2 straight away. Now you'd have to design to Amendment 2. So we've moved on a bit then. We've said that you had that 6-month window. You always have that 6-month window available with any amendment or change. But the key difference is the old standard got withdrawn on the 27th of September. And that's not a term that we've used before. And that could catch a lot of people out. So BS 7671 now follows the rest of the British standards. Once that standard becomes obsolete, it gets withdrawn. And withdrawn just means that no maintenance will be done by the standards committees anymore. They will just work on the most current standard to update it. So in this case, it would be in a new brown book. So the other week on the 27th of September, you all should have started working to the brown book, the Amendment 2. And there's a subtle change here. A few years ago, every amendment, every addition, we've been used to designing to an addition or an amendment. So we're, in this case, we're saying Amendment 1 or the 18th edition. And irrelevant to when we started that installation, we could start it and complete it to that amendment or that addition. However, with this new term withdrawn, this will now come down to what your contract says. So you must always install to the latest standard. That latest standard at the moment is Amendment 2. So if you've got contracts you haven't yet started, or you're starting, or you're part way through, or you're near completion, you need to have a conversation with those who you're engaged with, so your clients, your tier 1 contractors, to look what's in your contract to see what you're completing that installation to. If your contract determines you complete to the latest wiring standards, that's going to be Amendment 2. If it's the standard at time of when you started or signed the contract, that will more than likely be amendment 1. But it's really worth clarifying this, because as we go through this presentation, the top 10, you're probably going to see things that could impact your business with new technology, new regulations. It could be quite costly. So really do check your contracts and check that criteria of what you're going to complete your installation to. So now the new standards in, you should all be working to amendment 2, certifying to amendment 2. You can't cherry pick between the standards, but really important that you check your contracts. One small change with RCDs. RCDs for additional protection are still in existence, and they're in 3 locations. So use by ordinary persons, children, are disabled. That's the BA1, BA2, BA3 codes, which you'll find in Appendix 5. Use in other locations and use for outdoors. So indent 1 there, you know, ordinary persons, children, disabled, that's definitely all your domestic homes. So socket circuits under 32 amp for single phase, 3-phase, that includes industrial outlets as well. So they're pretty much mandated in every single socket location, unless the option to omit that, and that still exists for indent 2, that's other locations. So you'll be very hard pushed to do this domestically because of indent 1. You'll also be very hard pushed to try and do this in indent 3, use of outdoors. But if you've got sort of critical infrastructure environments, so data centers, process driven environments where it might be essential that you switch in and switch out equipment very quickly, and it's in a controlled environment, then a risk assessment still exists for those commercial and industrial applications if you're using socket outlets, for example, the C-norm industrial ones. And it's really important here that your client completes the risk assessment. You, by all means, guide them, and we have those forms here available at the ECA for our members, but it's really important that your client goes through that risk assessment process, and it's a live risk assessment. So it's keeping that a controlled environment. So in terms of a data center, you know, there's access restrictions, the equipment is checked, there's only, you know, skilled people carrying that out. So it's ideal that your, you know, it's probably that your client fills out the risk assessment, you know, with your supervision, and you append that to your electrical installation certificate. So just to say that the risk assessment does still exist. It's not there for domestic, it is there for industrial and commercial, and it's your client who's responsible for completing that, and ensure that you append that to your electrical certification. Also, just to say there, I think years ago where we might have installed socket outlets predominantly in offices, so like floor track systems, traditionally they weren't RCD protected. What we're saying is, just because you instruct someone or you tell someone, look, that socket outlet is not RCD protected, doesn't make them instructed. So there's a new note there that say that ordinary persons don't become instructed electrically when you give them a directive. So just by telling someone, look, a word of warning, don't plug anything into that socket because it's not RCD protected, is not valid anymore. It doesn't make them an instructed person. Additional earth electrodes. So a lot of talk about this earlier on in earlier editions and regulations and amendments about foundation earthing, and that hasn't really materialized here for amendment 2, and that was because obviously putting foundation electrodes into a building, so was it going to be the builder's job, was it going to be the electrical contractor's job, who's going to take the onus in that? And this all sort of came about because we all know some of the failings of the DNO, you know, the open pen, the earth neutral situation where, you know, there's a risk of loss of earth. But it is, however, important to remember that under ESQCR, that you should always have a permanent connection to your installation, and that's you know, determined by the ESQCR. However, we know the situation we're in, that there can be loss of pen, loss of neutral, loss of earth, and it's a recommendation for an additional earth electrode, and that's all it is. It's a recommendation, and we'll come on to that shortly. But where you might want to consider additional earth electrodes on a TN system is where you're probably looking at prosumer installations, which are going to come on to later on. So you may find that in certain installations, you may need this as a regulation requirement. And it's really prominent here that we talk about the word recommendation, because a lot of people see this as a shall, and it's not. As we all know, a shall is mandatory. That's what we're going to have to do. A recommendation is also known as should. Now, should sounds like shall, but it's not. A recommendation is exactly that. And what a recommendation is an expression in the content of a document conveying that amongst several possibilities, one is recommended as particularly suitable without mentioning or excluding others. So an engineering recommendation is you stop it, not doing nothing. You can't do nothing, but you can have a think. You can document the risks, you can do some risk assessments, you could provide something equally as good, or you may determine that it's not required. But as per the recommendation, you've stopped and had a think about it. And that's really, really important. But remember what the word shall means, and that's mandatory. And remember what the word recommendation means. It does mean you can stop and have a think and use your engineering judgment. AFDDs. So there's a lot of talk about this, and no doubt this will be in the Q&A later. But it was a recommendation before, and now it's a shall in 4 main areas. So this follows the RCD regulation. So those who are familiar with the RCD regulation, you'll probably see this sort of mirrors the RCD regulation for the FDDs. So again, it's single phase socket circuits up to 32 amp. So it's not 3-phase, it's just single phase socket outlets up to 32 amp in 4 locations. So higher risk residential buildings, HRRBs, and these are deemed as 18 meters in height or excess of 6 stories, whichever is met first. Houses in multiple occupation, so they should be quite easy to determine. They are normally licensed buildings. Purpose-built student accommodation. Again, that's more looking at, for example, the high rise. It's not a building or not a house you just lend out to or rent out to students. This is purpose-built student accommodation. Tends to be those high-rise buildings you see at university complexes, but not necessarily. And care homes. In all other locations, they're recommended. So the reason for those 4 areas are they traditionally are harder areas of increased risk, and also areas which may be harder to evacuate. So in terms of how AFDDs afford protection, we're used to very, very sort of high fault currents and very low impedances to disconnect those circuits very quickly. So with AFDDs, they have a microprocessor on board, and they're constantly monitoring these circuits. So despite common belief, they're hanging on to the last minute to do a disconnection. Now they may do that very quickly, but they're looking at serial arcing and they're looking at parallel arcing. And this regulation here is in thermal effects. So we want to stop fires. And that's why this regulation came in. Those areas which are hard to evacuate and therefore the risk of fires. So AFDDs, do they work? Do they not work? Well, their product standard has them working above 2.5 amps. So they're only tested above 2.5 amps. And that's predominantly why you won't see them on lighting circuits, but you'll certainly see them on socket circuits. We don't know the effectiveness of an AFDD with any other cable other than PVC, because PVC is in the standard. So they've come into our regulations now. They're a shall in these 4 areas. They're recommended in other places, and they have some small limitations, including the ability maybe to update them in the future. However, as technology moves on, manufacturers are finding ways to field update these. So just be aware that, especially if you're switching over from Amendment 1 to Amendment 2 in your build, and you have to allow, there's going to be additional costs for these as well. Protected escape routes, and this is a very common question we get asked. The word protected escape route is not a new term in our industry. It's been around forever and a day. In fact, it is mentioned in other British standards. But it's a new term in 7671, And it's really for awareness, to make you aware of what a protected escape route is. Now, I think we're all very good at the moment in working in escape routes. We're supporting those cables, we're putting, you know, those 30, 60, 90, 120-minute fire barriers in to protect those to an extreme that if a building did burn down, our wiring systems were all perfectly erect there in the building. This comes on to something else, a protected escape route. And what that is in your mind's eye is it's one of those sort of really sort of damp, dark, cold stairwells or corridors where there's no paint on the walls, there's no carpet, there's no ceiling tiles. Literally, it's just a fire sterile zone, and it's been engineered as a fire sterile area just to get you out of that building. So typically it's at the end of the buildings, or it might even be in the core, but they're those areas that only have the means of escape to help you out. So they will just have some lighting, some emergency lighting, some life safety systems, so fire detection, other life safety systems, maybe a cleaner socket, just to get you out of that area. It's important that if you're working in these areas that you know what one is. It's also important that person responsible for the building needs to be informed and inform you. So importantly, it's someone else making these decisions, not you, the electrical contractor. So it's the person responsible. It's part of fire engineering of that building, of what you do. And if you're working in there, there's a set of requirements of how to select and erect your materials, what cabling to use, keeping them as short as possible, and basically not adding to the fire loading of that area. So that's really important when you come to work in these environments. What's really important as well, in case you get asked to run some additional services in these areas. So it's really important that you as a contractor go to the person responsible, so that'll be the responsible person for the building or the fire engineer, and say, and have a conversation with them. Because what you shouldn't be doing is, and I know riser space is at a premium now, is thinking, I can just put a cable up between 2 floors, and if I go up the stairwell, that helps me out a lot. Well, you're adding to the fire loading of a building. So unless it's specifically engineered for that area, and you have the permission from the person responsible for that area, and you're going to make sure that you don't affect the integrity or the fire loading of that area, and it's about protected escape routes, then that's what you need to do. So it's really important that you clarify what works are being done, where they're being done, the person responsible for those, and you both hand over sufficient information. And that's all given here in this new regulation on there. Surge protection. So this has changed a little bit from previous. Before, we were all used to a big map of the UK, and we had an equation. We had to know where your LV feeder was, your HV feeder was, your distances, and you put it into a calculation. You determined if you were rural or if you were urban, and that was always up to interpretation. And you came out with a calculated risk level, CRL, and that would tell you if you needed SVD protection or not. And it's very confusing. So what happened was the regulation has now been clarified to SVDs are a shall in 3 main areas here. So that's serious injury to or loss of human life, failure of a safety service as defined in part 2, and we'll come on to that definition later, or significant or financial data loss. In all other areas, they should be provided unless the owner of the installation declares it's a tolerable risk. So if we're going back to those main 3 areas there, they are a shall, and sort of just to clarify, a domestic hardwired smoke alarm system is a safety service as defined in BS 7671, because it's an audible to alert. So if you are extending or you are providing a new smoke alarm service, smoke alarm wiring in a domestic property, you will need to provide SVD protection for that. You also need to provide it in these other locations. So it's pretty much on most industrial commercial applications. The only difference there is the risk assessment does exist, and for our members we have a risk assessment for you that if the owner declares that there's tolerable risk, then you can admit those, but they're pretty much mandated in most places now. bonding of outbuildings. So there doesn't seem to be an amendment or addition we don't go through where we don't make some changes to earthing and bonding, and this has been the case here. But what we've done is we've clarified this. We've made it really easy to understand. Hopefully those doing these installations will save time, money. Your clients will save time and money. So this is for TT and TNS earthing arrangements only, not PME. If you've got an outbuilding and you run a tiny little cable to that from your big installation, if you've got, like to say, we'll say a security hut, and if you've been really, really nice and you've provided your security officer with a toilet and a sink, but you've put a metal pipe in, then that's obviously extraneous and needs bonding. Traditionally, with a TNS system, you would have to have sized that outgoing cable in accordance with your incoming supply to the building. So you may have had to run, for example, a little 6mm cable to that outbuilding and then a 25mm cable down there as well, or size that LV feeder out to the outbuilding with a 25mm. It's quite wasteful. Now you can bond locally to that outbuilding in accordance to the LV feeder coming into that building alone, so not your supply. This should mean that for TNS and TT systems, if you've got a little 6mm cable or 10mm cable going out there, it's a 6 or 10 locally, just local in that installation you bond that service to. No requirement to run it all the way back to the MET. It should save a lot of time and a lot of money, and I'm glad that's been clarified by the regulations. If you've got a PME supply, there still will be cases where you have to run that back to the MET, could be up to a 50mm bonding conductor. So we haven't been able to, and that's because of the risk of open pen. But for TT and TNS systems, hopefully we've saved some time and some copper. So solar PV. It's matured a lot in the last few years, and what was 4 pages or 5 pages is now 14 pages. And what the regulations have done essentially is put a code of practice in there. So it was it's now an established technology. It was a new technology all those years ago. It's now an established technology. More and more contractors I see are offering solar PV, normally with other forms of storage or EV charging. So it really has grown the last few years, especially the last couple of months. So the regulations have been updated to reflect that, and also some new technologies associated with solar. So with solar now, guidance is there about cable sizing, cable protection, and it falls in line with what we do with AC circuits, only now for DC circuits. So there's a bit more emphasis now on design criteria, cable selection, overcurrent devices for DC strings as well, solar voltage optimizers. So those of you using Solar Edge, they've been recognized now in BS 7671. We've always got to assume that the DC side is live, but again, with those micro inverters and those Solar Edge devices, they default down to 1 volt DC, so that's been recognized as a safe system. They're just making sure that the type B RCD is the go-to unless your manufacturer of the inverter states otherwise. And there's also additional considerations for SPD protection, insulation monitoring devices, unless that's afforded by your inverter. So it's now a really big established technology. It's grown a lot of legs. We've got some great guidance here at the ECA on this. We've got a guidance note on it on 712. But if you are involved in solar, it's really good that if you look through your new brown book, just flick over those new 14 pages. Most of it's probably what you've been used to in your code of practice anyway, but just in case there's some changes, have a good look through that. Here's the really exciting bit. So prosumers. So you thought you got to the end of part 7 and then it went to the appendices, all the sort of the nice bits to know. Well, now we've got a new part in there. It's part 8 and it's all about the prosumer, and we start at chapter 82. Don't worry about chapter 81 and 83, we'll come on to those later, but just to set the scene for the prosumer, we've all been used to consumption. We've all been consumptive people. We just take energy from the grid, and especially of late we all know the failings of that and energy shortages and what can affect energy shortages. So with the prosumer, that is an installation that not only consumes energy but can store it and give it back. So you've got the energy prosumer there. And what the energy prosumer needs is the prosumer's electrical insulation. So that's what the PEI. And we've got one version here. There are several different configurations of this. This is just one of them. But essentially what we're doing, we're taking all those renewables. So solar, some battery storage, because you might have an electric vehicle or external battery storage, wind, other forms of generation. We're moving away from gas, so we've got a heat pump there. We've got other appliances in the home, and they're all becoming very much smart. And the best way to use all that is to have an electrical energy management system. So that's the brain of the operation inside, traditionally, your home. So that's looking at tariffs, it's looking at the weather, it's looking at your devices, it's looking at the time of day, your load, when to buy best from the grid, when to give that energy back to the grid, when to store it, when to charge your car, when to discharge your car to run your house, maybe when to sell your energy to your neighbours, or maybe buy your energy from your neighbours because it's cheaper than the grid. So there are a lot of interactions here with lots of devices, with the grid, and there's multiple configurations. We talked about the additional earth electrode just some time ago. Well, you may want to consider that in these installations here. And all the meat on the bones on this is in Appendix 17, which talks about energy efficiency. And that will probably become Chapter 81 later on. But this is obviously the prosumer. It's a great growing field, and really give that a good read of the new book. Certification. So we've changed this slightly. With the update to the new regulations, it was felt that electrical contractors didn't want to tick 116 boxes on the electrical certificate, and this was put in, from the general public, from electricians. They said that they didn't want to keep ticking all these boxes. So the Wiring Regulations Committee listened to that, and now for new installs only, so just on your electrical certificate, there's only 14 boxes to tick. They're still there for EICRs, for periodics. You've still got 116 plus a couple more check boxes. The 116 items, the schedule's still there in Appendix 6 if you want to aid memoir, but in terms of sort of chopping down some of your ink you want to use on these forms going forward, it should be much shorter. There's some very slight little changes to the minor works and EICR forms just to bring them in line, also some new devices, and the scheduler test results and circuit details are now over 2 pages, which you've probably been using software for many years anyway. It was just determined that with our new devices, SPDs, FDDs, etc., we just need a bit more space on those forms. So there should be more forms there for you to help sort of more spaces in the boxes there. We got a good webinar on how to complete certification. We can go into at a later date, but there's a few more options now on these forms to use them better, I think. So covered on some bonus information. These are just some extra bits we're going to go into from the top 10. And one of those is we talk about we love to change earthing and bonding. It just seems to happen every single amendment. This time round, the word metallic is there. So if we were looking to bond extraneous services, the word metallic specifically has been used. And it's just a reminder there that it's not only your traditional water, gas, but also any service that comes into a building. So it could be your foul or sewer pipe, it could be your sewer pipes, for example. Quite often they are missed in risers. So it's any metallic, and the word metallic has been used this time round. Going on to domestic installations, so this is not commercial or industrial, just domestic. Years ago, people used to steam labels off their consumer units to make them look nice and pretty. They didn't like us plastering full of labels. So it's been agreed now that you don't have to put all those labels onto consumer units. You can keep them looking nice and pretty. You do need to put the alternative source label on. That warning still has to go on somewhere on that distribution board. Many people don't realise you can lift the lid and put some labels nicely inside. But the option to omit a lot of labelling is now there for domestic properties, providing you produce a handover guide, so a bit like a small O&M or domestic handover pack, and we got that available here for ECA members as well. If you omit labels from the consumer unit, you must give your client the handover pack so they can file it and lose it. You can't just omit the labels and forget it. You can do both. You can put labels on there and a handover document, but you can't just not put the labels on and not give a handover pack. It's one or the other. Introduction of RCD, socket outlets and fuse spurs. So there was some confusion with this. The standards didn't quite line up last time round, and strictly speaking, if you were using RCD socket outlets, you should have put a departure in the amendment 1 to say you were using these, because at the time the 7288 standard wanted an RCD protection at the front of the circuit and also at the endpoints, which sort of made it pretty pointless, and that's why the standards didn't align. However, all standards align now. 7288 socket outlets and RCD spurs are back in the regulations. You don't have to protect them at the front end with an RCD unless your cable insulation requires that. But I know these are very popular with floor boxes, for example, and they're a great outlet. You can put those on now to amendment 2 and not worry about any departures. Insulation resistance testing. This has changed, and it's just been clarified that we should all be testing at new circuits, so not periodic, so new circuits. We should all be testing at 500 volt DC, and we should have been doing that before, but many electrical contractors read that wrong with the 250 blanket test at the end of your installation. So what's being said now is ensure that you test at 500 volt DC before you connect in sensitive equipment. Then connect that equipment in and complete your testing further with a 250 volt DC test, and note that on your certification. It may add to the amount of time you need to complete your installations and complete your certification periods. Also, it may change the way you choose to design and install lighting circuits, other circuits with pluggable roses, for example, so you can help unplug those sensitive pieces of equipment as you test. But just be aware that the 500 volt testing is now firmly back in, so allow extra time for that. With allowing extra time for your IR testing, we can take away that time for your RCD testing. So now RCD testing, irrelevant of its fault protection or additional protection, you just test at ×1, just a 1 times test. There's no requirement to test at any other, so half, 5 or gone, unless you want to do that for fault finding, but you don't have to. And just to clarify there, it doesn't matter if it's a type A, AC, B, EV, F, A+, whatever RCD you've got on your circuit, you only set your test equipment to AC. So you just test, whatever testing you've got you're using last week, last year, you can use today, tomorrow, next year. Set that to the AC setting, and just a ×1 test is all that's required going forward. So that should speed up your RCD testing. And this came about because an RCD is a product, and we don't test circuit breakers, fuses, MCBs, etc. So why should we test a product standard? Also, these products are already tested for us, so we should be able just to install and forget. Also, a lot of manufacturers were having these returned because we weren't testing them correctly. We were choosing other tests on our tester, like a DC injection, to do that. So just to be clear on that, regardless of what RCD you've installed, fault or additional type, it's just ×1 and just on the AC setting. There's no requirements to do any other test unless your contractual requirements wish you to do so, and you should clarify those. But going forward, this should speed up your RCD testing. RCDs and outside lighting. So there's been a small change here which may be a big impact. So for domestic properties anyway, RCD protection came in some time ago on all circuits, including lighting circuits, so we've been used to that. They came in now to more industrial commercial settings because of the sad death of a 9-year-old boy in a pub garden who went to retrieve his ball, I think, between a lamppost and a fence, and suffered a fatal electric shock. Now, the landlord, I believe, got 9 years imprisonment and the electrician got 1 year imprisonment. And HSE came to the wiring regulations and asked for this to be put in. So this is affecting all outside lighting circuits which are accessible to touch by the public. So that's not anything to do with highways or probably railway platforms. There is a list of exclusions in 714, and if you're involved with this, definitely give us a read. But this may change the way that you select components, apparatus, equipment for outside lighting, you know, to avoid as much moisture ingress as possible, because with now the additional RCDs needed for that, so that's going to be in sort of car parks, bollard lighting, etc. It may cause you, they may be more prone to tripping. So give this a good look. Also have a look at that regulation as well, because it may affect some of the work you're doing. Incidentally, if the lighting is not accessible to touch, and it gives definitions on that, so it could be on the side of a building, for example, then it wouldn't necessarily need RCD protection. And we say the regulations move up the times. Those who are working on larger installations, who may be doing a trefoil arrangement, you can now pop the neutral in that, because the quad cleat has been recognised. It may save you some time, materials, and installation costs when it comes to installing trefoil cables, because you can now pop the neutral inside those cleats as well. And I think Ellis Patent do a very good one. So again, the regulations move with the times, and they always include some new technology. So these are not all the changes. We've been through the top 10 plus the bonus bits. If you're working in specific areas, then really give those a good look in the book as well and update your knowledge. If you're an ECA member, we've got a whole list of guidance notes, I think 16 plus guidance notes to support our members, and they're available through our website and through our app. Coming on to some training and compliance now. So this is a common question we get asked, and this has been the same for every amendment and regulation update, is when a new edition comes out, you should be getting that new edition training. So in this case, we're still on the 18th edition. So if you hold an 18th edition qualification, even if it was the original 18th edition or 18th edition amendment 1, there's no requirement to go through recertification for the amendment 2. You're just expected to update your knowledge. And what better way than attending webinars like this, any other webinars or guidance, reading guidance notes, short courses. Helps if they're CPD accredited, but they don't have to be. Just keep a log of your training. If you don't have an 18th edition wiring qualification, then you really should. And that's something you're probably going to need going forward, especially with your assessments if you're a qualifying supervisor, for example. So just to make it clear, if you've already got your 18th edition, you just need to top up your knowledge. If you haven't got your 18th edition, you really should have it by now. So what can we do to help? The ECA have a larger presentation. So normally this is delivered over about a 3-hour period, and that's where we put a lot of meat on the bones. And a lot of you may have seen us doing this through the UK over the last 6 months. So we can't cover all the changes, but we have a lot of guides available on our website, and you can go to our technical area there. And those who are ECA members can always give us a call on the technical helpline or email us at technical@eca.co.uk. We've talked about compliance, so login your training and login for CPD. We have a great package available to our members called Ecomms, and that'll be fantastic for logging you and your operatives into that for your next ECA or NIC or other assessments. So your search your assessment when they come along under the EAS will now be looking for training compliance. We've got a great free package here for our members called Ecomms, and our regional managers can go through that with you. So just to summarise this, there's far more what we can go through today, but hopefully we've covered some of the really important bits, probably those bits that you may not have been aware of or could cost you more money or time on projects. Like I say, we've not covered everything, but we do have a lot of resource available, and our technical team are certainly on hand to answer any questions. And then that will lead us nicely on to questions and answers, and hopefully Shahid's been fielding them throughout the presentation.
Yeah, brilliant. So That was a really good presentation, Darren. So thank you for that. In terms of questions, we have had quite a few through. So I think what we'll do is if we work through these together, I think we can help people out here. So the first question that came in was from Howard, who says, can we get some further clarification in relation to the dates of Amendment 2 coming into use and the application of Amendment 2 in respect to the design and the start date and a commencement date? So he's just looking for a little bit more in terms of clarification. So I mean, in terms of my opinion on that, it already has come into force as of the 27th of September, I believe. So that's when Amendment 2 is in essence live. There is no real stipulation as there used to be in terms of if an installation was designed previous to that, and whether you can carry on using that. That's no longer possible. Literally from the 27th of September onwards, you must be designing, installing, inspecting and testing to Amendment 2, i.e. the Brown Book. Is there anything you want to add in there, Darren?
No, it's like all BS 7671 is following all other standards. 5266 emergency lighting, for example, 9991, quadruple 9, some of the other fire security standards, that it should be the latest going forward unless your contract states otherwise. And I believe the terms you need to look there for is if it's along the lines of, and take your own legal counsel on this. We've got 2 solicitors in our London office for ECA members who are eager for you to contact them on this, but it's just to clarify that some contracts will state complete to what was in force at time of signing the contract. Others will state something along the lines of you must complete to the latest regulations in force at the time of completion. So they are 2 different things. Yeah. Again, take your own legal counsel on that. For ECA members, we've got 2 cracking solicitors in our London office who will look at that, but it comes down to those contract terms.
Yeah, so if there's any projects that are part way through, it's important for people to check the terms in terms of that contract and advise your clients accordingly. So if you have to upgrade now to Amendment 2, there's obviously a cost implication there. So you need to have that conversation with your clients sooner rather than later, I think.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
There's quite a lot of questions that's come through on AFDDs. I wasn't surprised about this one. First question was, do AFDDs work on LSF cables? I don't mind fielding that.
You can field that one?
Yeah, so look, to be honest, the jury's out. We don't know for definite. That we need further research in this area. It's a brand new part of the market here. We definitely know that they work with PVC cabling because you've got a solid carbonized path that the device can use to track the arc across and detect the imbalance or detect the noise that's on the actual signature and send a signal to a switching device. With LSF cable and LSOH type cable, it's difficult to say. The reason I say that is some of them don't carbonize, some of them do, and what it would require is a full sort of test process of each manufacturer, each type of cable, until we've got some kind of verifiable data. So it's a really good question. The honest answer is we don't actually know at the moment.
No, we only know what the product standard says, and that's no different to any other product standard, isn't it? Same as the wiring standard, British standard, what we hopefully all install to today. We can only go with what's in that standard. Yes, it's frustrating, the rest is unknown, but I'm sure you know, standards change and hopefully that will be clarified in the future.
Yeah, it's quite difficult trying to translate the product standard into practical in situ conditions because you need something that's repeatable, reliable, and valid in terms of to check the products against, and that sometimes it's just difficult to manifest in practical in situ conditions. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard. There's other questions that have come in on AFDDs. One from Craig that says, why don't you need AFDDs in hospitals? Again, I don't mind with that one, Darren. So if you go to 710 medical locations, regulation 710.421.1.7 stipulates that they're not required in group 1 and group 2 type installations and may be used in group 0 following a risk assessment. What I'd say here is it just depends on the level of risk and the type of system that you've got in that hospital. Typically, it's an IT system designed not to trip, continuously monitored. So the last thing you'd want in there is a device that's going to disconnect, immediately and then cause a greater danger. So that's potentially the reason why. Darren, do you want to add anything to that?
I think on the obviously, because what we highlighted there is a lot has changed. So for Craig, if he's in the medical area, a lot has changed with 710. We've got 2 cracking guides on our ECA website available for you. We've spoken to a lot of experts in these field who run large estates in sort of hospitals across the UK. But hospitals and medical locations are an area of increased risk anyway. That's why they're in Part 7. And this is like an equivalent of, in those certain areas, they are providing, enhanced protection for their sort of cabling systems anyway. So we've not gone on to section 710 today. We do a 3-hour presentation on the whole of Amendment 2. We could probably do a 3-hour presentation just on 710, but we've got 2 cracking guides, Craig, if you want to download those off our website.
Thanks, Darren. Another one again on AFDDs. It's a job. It's from another Craig. I don't think it's the same Craig. But it says we are working on an 8-story office block, and the consultant has specified AFDDs on all circuits with socket outlets. Is this not required? Well, if you look at 421.1.7, it talks about it being mandatory on HRRBs, higher risk residential buildings. An office block wouldn't necessarily form part of that unless it's a potential mixed use development, because you do end up with those types of situations. So if you look at the definition in relation to the Building Safety Act, it talks about higher risk residential being those types of buildings that have a certain height requirement, but also contain at least 2 residential units. So it just depends. I would need a little bit more information to give you a proper answer on that, Craig. And again, it's revert back to the contract, revert back to your client and the requirements there. So sorry, it's not a yes or no answer.
Well, no, because again, the Building Safety Act came out after the definition of HRRB came into the regulations. So in the standards, this had to be set 4 years ago, and the Building Safety Act has only now just become an act. And it's really important, like Shahid said, is the Building Safety Act should also be closely followed, because we'll probably see that come into our wiring standards at a later date. But it also comes down to whoever's engineered that design. They may feel that there's increased risk. So normally consultants, designers do put these in for good reason. Normally it's reasons far beyond what electrical contractors get informed. That's probably why they've also got in there as well.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. There's a note in 42117 that gives you the stipulations in terms of the height requirements, but it carries on when we're talking about HRRBs, and it says that any statutory legislation that comes out following it should be followed. So in essence, the Building Safety Act trumps the definition within 7671 of what a HRRB is. Okay, yes. So we stick with the legislation. Okay. Another question. It's not a Craig this time. It's Charlie. Using Amendment 2, do the landlords cleaner sockets within a high-rise block of flats require AFDD protection? Yes, that's a simple one. Yeah,
it's one of those ones which is follows hazardous areas, isn't it? You're in the curtilage of the building still, aren't you? So
Yeah. So I mean, just from a risk element there, you want to try and limit your risk. So for me, that's a straightforward yes. I'm putting AFDD protection on that circuit. Okay.
I
Because
think
it'd
it's
be hard
important
to
also
build
to note
up an argument against that. That would be.
it is. I think
Go on,
also
Darren.
with AFDDs is they're not also designed to look at the circuits. They've also there to offer enhanced protection to items that are plugged in. So damage to those flexes, etc.
Yeah, no, totally agree. A question from Andy. So we're moving away from AFDDs. We're now talking about SPDs. What would be classed as significant financial loss to not mitigate using SPDs?
Such a subjectional question. So my understanding is that if you had a data center, you've probably got millions or billions of pounds worth of investment running through that infrastructure every minute. So that would be something I think I would say that's a significant or financial data loss. Where it becomes more tolerable maybe is maybe down in the domestic home, where you should have a conversation with the homeowner of what they deem a tolerable risk is. So we've got a sliding scale of trillions to maybe a few £100. We can't give you a definitive answer, but that is the sliding scale. It depends what you may deem a risk. My definition of risk may not be tens of pounds, it may be hundreds. Shahid's definition of risk may be different. So it comes down to asking that person. And also that's why it's important it's documented.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Just reinforcing what you're saying there, Darren. That type of question requires a conversation with the duty holder. It's the person that's responsible for the installation that must answer what they deem is a significant financial loss. And if they deem it to be, of a significant level, then, from our perspective, we're putting SPDs in. It's as simple as that. Let's see what else we've got. Yeah, there's a question here on testing of RCDs. And Ian says RCDs do fail a lot more than any MCBs, so maybe we should be testing them thoroughly. We've all had one of these fail in the past. So how would you? So it's not really a question. It was more of a statement. But how would you sort of contextualize that, Darren?
We don't know if MCBs have failed. Yeah,
exactly.
Thinking that one there is certainly when I was a contractor, I never took an MCB or BS88 fuse or an MCCB, which had set, a variable setting, and I wouldn't put 160 amps or 100 amp fuse to see if it failed. One, I'd struggle to, especially in my own home, but I'd never test those thermal limitations or the product standard of those devices. We've always left it to the manufacturer to install it to that British standard, and that's all we need to do. The same with RCDs, but we've just had the ability to test, and often we've been getting of late a lot of false negatives.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Totally agree. What else have we got here? Sorry, they're just scrolling through. It takes quite a while.
It's good to have lots of questions.
Yeah, definitely. There's one from Richard. Can we still use a risk assessment if not protecting socket outlets, especially those designated for IT use only? I think information technology use there. Yeah.
In a commercial industrial environment, absolutely. And just make sure it's appended to your electrical certification.
Yeah, good. Okay, one from Andy. I tried to steer away from the EICR coding type question, but there is one. What happens if you complete an EICR and there are no labels for the owner and the owner's lost the handover pack potentially? So there's no information at all for the installation.
So normally this follows exactly the same as what it is today, and it will probably be no different to many of you who go around domestic properties and find there's no labels. In fact, there's many never labels commercially, unfortunately. Again, in most times it's a code 3. The only label that would attract a code 2 will be the alternative source, and I think possibly the FDD warning notice. So if it's missing a couple of these warning notices that are a requirement, then they would potentially go from a 3 to a 2, but in most cases it would start at a 3. And that's going on to if there might be many more questions about how do we code this and how do we code that. Traditionally, always when there's an update in the regulations, they're not retrospective. So it was safe, perfectly safe 2 weeks ago, but today we're not putting an AFDD on that circuit. At the most, it would probably be a code 3.
Brilliant, thanks, Darren. And then I think we've got one last question. We've got loads of questions on coding, but I think it'd take forever if we started answering them. I think you've hit this sort of the point with your last answer there, Darren. It's pretty much a default C3 unless there's justified cause to raise the level up to something that's going to be dangerous.
And with those with those coding questions as well, Electrical Safety First have some brilliant resources, and they've got a sort of well, I could say top 10, but it's a top 100 questions and answers for new installs and periodics, and that's the general consensus of everyone in the industry to help you understand what these regulations mean. So they are available under the professional resource section of Electrical Safety First, the same as best practice guides as well.
Yeah, really good point there, Darren. Yeah. I think one last question. I think I'll pick on this one because it's a bit different. So it's from a guy called Mark, and he's asking about protected escape routes. And it's, does wiring in a protected escape route need to be of enhanced rating in respect of a fire detection system? So do we need to use enhanced cables within a protected escape route?
So that's all determined in that regulation. It does give you examples of the type of cabling you should be using in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, there's stipulations in there, isn't there? In terms of, a typical type of cable, it gives you a light transmissency test.
That's right.
I can't remember the right word for it, so I blagged that one, so I do apologise.
It's an interesting one. It's not can you see through the cable, it's as the cable burns and gives off a smoke,
the smoke,
how much light you see through the smoke. So a lot of people were holding up cables to the light and going, oh, how's that going to reach 40%? So it's to do with a standard. It was if those areas overcome, it's how you can safely see through that to escape. And a lot of this came from King's Cross all those years ago, you see.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that regulation does actually carry on, and it also references 560.8, which is to do with safety services and cables that you can use when we're talking about safety services. And there you've got your bog standard references to FP type cabling, mineral insulated, or using a standard cable that's mechanically protected against the effects of fire. So that the 60% element was only one of those options.
Yeah.
We will do one more because again we haven't spoke about this one, so it's a good question. Why is regulation 411.4.2 only a recommendation? So this is the one that talks about an additional earth electrode on a TN system. Why is it only a recommendation? Why is it not mandatory? Is the question.
I haven't got a solid answer for that, but what I can say is in a TN situation, it should be following ESQCR anyway. So
correct.
That's determined for us before. We take our installations on from the DNO. They are obligated under law to give us a solid neutral earth connection, and then we take it on from there. We're not responsible for that bit before. Incidentally, by the way, if you ever come across an open pen or a broken pen or an incident, call 105 straight away and relay that information straight to the DNO. It doesn't matter where you are in the country. Throughout our presentations, we toured a lot of the UK, and we found out it differs from area to area. Some places have never experienced broken pen, whereas down in South Wales, it seems to be a daily occurrence over there. And I've since learned actually it's a bit more frequent than that. So it doesn't matter where you are in the UK, dial 105, that'll get you through to the DNO or DSO, as they are now. Another definition that's changed in BS 7671. So they're now, a system operator, but give them a call. In terms of what we're doing, it's a little bit like what we do in section 722, although we've not spoken about EV today, is we're very good at putting sticky plasters over other parts, things that don't fall within, our, remit, so we are considering the risk of loss of open pen and touch voltages. I think some people who's worked in those situations will see it's an elevation in metalworks, and pipes and radiators can become, way above 0 volts. So we're just mitigating against that loss there. But you're right, it's a sticky plaster.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer there, Darren. So what about when we think about 41142 in the context of a prosumer installation? Is that somewhere where it might be beneficial to drop an earth rod in?
Yeah, so in they have different modes. The prosumer has different modes on how you're going to control and collect and do those assets. So one I showed is literally a standalone system, but that might be split over. But there will be certain configurations, and especially with battery storage, creating a TN link and bits. So they are, manufacturers, and those configurations are requiring those to go in. If you think back to the days of generators, so the British standard of earthing as well, is at certain circumstances you're going to need a 0 volt reference anyway. You might need some other mitigating additional safety. So that's why this is sort of coming in now as well.
So what you're saying there is, if we are operating in island mode, we can't rely on the supplier's reference to earth. We have to have our own that has to be totally separate. So when we're switching into that mode, it makes sense to have a reliable path to earth via this earth electrode.
And that's the words that are already that are there. It's contractors, or we're in charge of our own installations, need to provide a reliable path to earth. We've had this for many years with generator sets over 10 kVA, for example. It's been a similar thing there. So we just got to provide this now with our own generation, but that's why it's in addition to. We shouldn't be relying on their form of earth. We need to also rely on ours.
Yeah. No, I think that's brilliant. So I think that's all of the questions, other than the repeats and things. So I think we're pretty much done there.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Darren and Shahid, for that presentation, and thank you also to our viewers today for being so engaged and asking those really great questions. Darren, Shahid, just one last time for our viewers, where should they go to get more information, more support?
Go on, Darren.
ECA.co.uk has a big wealth of information, so especially for our members. But we've also mentioned Electrical Safety First website. So for those of you who aren't yet ECA members, then Electrical Safety First have some brilliant resources on there, and we did highlight some of those today.
Excellent, thank you both. And those resources we've mentioned will be in the description under the video if you're catching up on YouTube. Just a final reminder for our live viewers that you will receive your CPD certificates for today's presentation within the next 2 weeks using the email addresses that you provided when you registered for today's webinar. And with that said, that's it from us for today. Hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Cheers.
Thank you.